acts of sexual intercourse. To see parenthood as an undertaking of couples is an improvement, but it does not go far enough. Listen up. Parenthood makes sex, the couple's sexual relationship, fully accountable for and contributory to human well-being and interdependence in communities beyond the couple. In other words, they become participants in society in a unique and special way. As she finishes up here, although sexual couples can and should contribute to society and church in many ways, their union in parenthood is a specifically sexual mode of social participation. Okay. And so the idea here is that through the birthing of children, through the orientation towards procreation, we actually fulfill the be fruitful and multiply of the book of Genesis. We actually move towards society. Now, you can have, as a married couple with no children, significant participation in society. But children is a uniquely marital participation in society. That's the point that Lisa Soul Cahill is making here. Okay. Now, that leads us to an obvious question. If this is a significant part of God's design for sex, then does this have to be measured in each and every sexual act? Now, you may have thought, well, I don't really care about that. I would have never thought of that, but the Catholic Church has, and it's a significant part of why they oppose contraception. According to the teaching of the Catholic Church, because the procreative purpose of sex is part of sex, each and every sex act must be, quote, open to conception. The possibility of pregnancy must always be on the table for the sexual act to fulfill the purpose of our sexuality. Okay? And so they don't just oppose potentially abortive contraception like the morning after pill or potentially even the pill itself. But condoms or even pulling out would be a sinful behavior, a sinful way of stewarding your sexuality. Okay? But obviously, this makes it sound as sex for infertile couples or for the aged is somehow sinful. Okay? We're right to understand that that doesn't seem to cover the bases. There's been a tendency to seek to overthrow the procreative purpose of sex that we're talking about tonight entirely because of this misstep, elevating the intimate meeting, the relational meeting, to primary, and the procreative as, again, just a secondary side effect or an optional purchase on the reality, on the base package of marriage. Okay. There's a second point to be made here. Okay. If we follow the Catholic Church's way in that past, they run into a significant dead end. Because you need to remember that certain procreative stories in the Bible, especially the story, does not involve a sexual act, right? And so then a marriage between men can be open to conception because God can do whatever he wants, okay? But what I would suggest is it's much better to think of this as talking about not every individual sexual act, but the sexual relationship itself being open to procreation. Okay. The whole of the relationship. The procreative is part of the design of sexuality, not in every act, but in the full context of the relationship in marriage. Okay. I would suggest that if we're going to fully incorporate and understand a sexual ethic from the Bible's perspective, each and every marriage should be open to conception. Now, the question becomes then, what does that mean about contraception for the Christian? Okay. Before we can answer really hands-on questions like this, we need to organize the data. If we don't do so, we'll say dumb stuff. Okay. So first, some forms of birth control are abortive. And so from a Christian perspective that values the dignity of life, that looks at even an unborn embryo where life has begun as having the image of God and the dignity that comes to it, must be avoided. Other forms of birth control, I would suggest, and again, I'm talking about the instant of their use. I'm not talking about the broad relationship here, but the single decision at a single point in time to use contraception or not. We'll come back to the big in just a second. There are some forms of birth control that are not abortive, and I would suggest, again, that should be left to conscience. Okay. Here's my wife and I's story. Okay. My wife and I had our first son about 13 months after we got married, and we had our second son not even 13 months after that. My boys are a year and 2 weeks apart. Okay. What that meant for my wife was that hormonally, from the beginning of her pregnancy with my oldest to the end of her weaning my second child, she was completely off balance. In fact, when Ransom, my second son, was born, she had severe postpartum depression. And she was terrified of immediately getting pregnant again and finding another kid following on the heels. We were young and we were ignorant and we didn't really know. But all I wanted to do was meet my wife where we were at, and so we put her on the pill. And we made a commitment to figure these things out, and we started to do our research. As we did our research, we found that most forms of what we call the pill are concerning and should be for Christians, not because of the way they operate, but because of the way they can operate. You see, the pill involves 3 different ways that it prevents pregnancy. The first 2 involve preventing insemination. The last one involves slickening the lining of the uterine wall, so even an inseminated egg would not attach, but would just be passed out of the body. That is concerning. Now, we should understand that the happening of getting pregnant is so unseen and, to some degree, unexpected, and so small, we don't actually know if that third one ever happens. We don't know how effective the pill is in its different methods of working, but we can say that it is potentially abortive. Okay, and so that should be of concern. Now, here's another thing that I would suggest. We didn't just believe what we read on the internet. We took that to our doctor, who we trusted, who had delivered both of our sons, one which was a crash cesarean. And we said, this is how we understand the pill works. Is this accurate? And she said, yes. And we said, all right, well, we've also been looking at natural family planning. Where can we learn more about that? And she said, talk to the Catholic Church. Now, if you're not familiar, natural family planning has to do with monitoring a woman's natural cycle and not having sex when fertility is high. Okay. There are old and less reliable methods of this, sometimes called the rhythm method, which is not what I'm talking about. Okay, this one is a little bit more significant. It's an option only when women who are involved have relatively regular cycles. There's a lot of pieces to this, but it's surprisingly effective. And we used it to have 3 more children, 2 years apart consistently, without having any other issues or problems or surprises. Okay. Now, there was still a problem for me, which was, as I looked at any form of contraception, I had to ask myself, is this me interfering in God's will? Is it possible that me finding any way to avoid contraception, I'm not leaving pregnancy in the hands of the giver of life? But here's where I became relatively settled. What I like about natural family planning is that it is paying attention to what God naturally designed in the way that the human body works. Literally playing by the rules of creation. In other words, it made the stewarding of when to have children a category of wisdom instead of righteousness and sin. Okay. Now, again, I'm telling you this story not to give you the punchline so that you can all do it right finally, but to tell you that the process is what's important, that these conclusions should not just be taken, but considered and thoughtfully employed in these types of things. And let me point out that we also need to have this discussion about surrogacy. We also need to have this conversation about fertility practices, because many fertility practices inseminate multiple eggs, knowing the difficulty of any of them taking, and so also are possibly abortive. Those are things to be considered and thought about. Paul tells us in the book of Romans not to be conformed to the image of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. You know what that means as a Christian? It means you got to stop and think. Okay? And so that's what I'm suggesting, but I would still maintain that the idea of sexuality and its relationship to procreation and being open to conception is a over the course of your whole marriage thing. So I'll add another detail, since I've already laid all the intimate details of our relationship before you. Now that we've had 5 children, I've had a vasectomy. And there are some who would also say that I have finally and totally closed the door and once again taken things out of God's hands. Now, I will tell you honestly and fully, and I think I earned this right having 5 children, I love kids. And a large part of us would love to continue having kids. But being a pastor on Capitol Hill, we were running out of places to put them. Okay? In fact, we have 2 boys and 3 girls. If I was playing poker, that is literally a full house. Okay? And so it was a decision, again, one we made with care, not even one I can promise you we won't reverse. It's seriously that type of an issue for us because we love kids. And my wife is obsessed with babies. It took her a long time to realize that babies inevitably grow into kids, and she's not so fond of those. Okay? So what I'm suggesting here is we must maintain, at the very least, that a married relationship that permanently avoids having children. Now, when I say having children there, I don't want to reduce that down to pregnancy. Okay? The need for foster care, the possibility of adoption, the other physical matters that go into having children that can put the mother at risk. There are many things to consider here, but that fittedness between marriage and family, between a sexual relationship, biblically, and children should be maintained. And there are, at the very least, even if there are some good reasons to avoid having children, I understand when missionaries think what we're doing and what God has called us to is not child-friendly. I get that. What I'm more concerned about is the pervasive bad reasons that people choose to not have kids. Okay. In a culture like ours, there are many, many bad reasons that are ultimately definable as selfish, as often idolatrous, as misunderstanding children as a burden or even a curse instead of a blessing, and 1,000 other things. One of the things I love about being a big family on Capitol Hill is we feel like our life is prophetic. Those of you who have visited Capitol Hill know it's comparable to Pleasure Island. It is a place for youth and singleness and all of these things. And the truth is, when all you have around you is people who live life like you forget the blessings that you're missing out on. And we have a constant reminder of the goodness of children just when we walk down the sidewalk and apologize for being in the way. Okay? Remember here that the Bible sees God as the giver of children and therefore children as a gift. And that has to be a baseline understanding. Jesus says, suffer the little children to come to me. Do not hinder them. Okay? And so we should have a Christian view of children. Even in the beginning, listen to Eve's words. When the first babe is born, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Or, to make it even clearer, consider Psalm 127. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Now let me just add one more thing, because in the last few years, I've been hearing a new one on the rise that isn't about selfishness, isn't about focusing on the marriage, it's about fear. It's about, is it irresponsible to bring children into a world like this? But I will remind you, and it's bound up in this word heritage, that we are a people of hope. Okay? And so that has to be our posture. And the Lord has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. Okay, so we see this connection, these two things to go together. Why? Why is sex designed to be procreative? Obviously, one of the reasons is because marital intimacy is not the sole goal. Community is also part of the design. Sex is designed to push beyond the relationship between a man and woman and out, and it's especially observable for Adam and Eve, right? Because as soon as Adam and Eve add Cain and add Abel, now we have a family. And that family becomes a tribe. And that tribe becomes a community. And that community becomes a society, right? And as it spreads over the earth, there's a direct correlation between birth in the context of one couple and us sitting in this room right here. Okay? That's part of the design. Now, Stanley Grenz is the one who calls this then social sexuality. Now, if I had glasses, this is the place where I would push them up on my nose a little bit, because what we're about to do is a little bit technical. It may not serve you at all, but I do want to go through it. Because here, he makes a very good case and a very significant mistake. And by reviewing those, we'll get a better understanding of what's talking about here. This is what Grenz says. The concept of sexuality presented here suggests that a distinction exists between sexual desire and the desire for sex, both of which arise out of our basic sexuality. Sexual desire refers to the need we all share to experience wholeness, intimacy, and relationship with others. Okay? So for Grenz, sexual desire is why you have friendships. It's why you maintain relationships with your siblings. It's what draws you out of yourself. Okay? Out of being alone and into community, he would call sexual desire, whereas what happens in your marriage is just the desire for sex. He continues, he says, it relates to the dimension often called eros, the human longing to possess and be possessed by the object of one's desire. Understood in this way, eros ought not to be limited to genital sexual acts, but encompasses a broad range of human actions and desires, and it participates even in the religious dimensions of life in the form of the desire to know and be known by God. Okay. For many people, the desire for sex, the longing to express one's sexuality through genital acts, Venus, is psychologically inseparable from sexual desire. Nevertheless, for the development of true sexual maturity, a person must come to terms with the difference between these two dimensions and learn to separate them both in one's own psychological state and in overt action. Okay, a couple of things here. First, notice that Grenz has two goals in mind, and they're ones that we share. One, he wants to know how our sexuality as it plays out connects to our relationship with God, because it biblically does, and he follows the eros path just like we did. But he does so in a very different way, by making all of our relational drawing out of this of ourselves eros. Okay. Second, he's also trying to make the connection between the sexual relationship of a marriage and society as a whole. And so the problem is, by going about it this way, he makes things tremendously muddled and confusing. Okay. The textbook for this class picks up the concept as well, and might make it a little bit clearer for you, but all I think it does is make the muddledness clear. To reduce sexuality to sex is to miss the deeper essence. The greater part of sexuality is affective or social, including our fundamental need for relational intimacy across a broad range of nurturing friendships. Confusion in this area leads to crossover between sex and the social expression of our broader sexuality. There is, though, an important difference between the desire for sex, which is a physical urge, and sexual desire. Can you tell he's been reading Grenz? He has. Or eros, which covers a broad range of human longing, including our yearning to know our Creator. It's important for Christians to differentiate between these two senses psychologically, emotionally, and in our practical lives. Okay. Now, here's the problem. I'm going to jump to the end of this. Here's the problem. Mega DeFranza looks at this and she understands something's gone wrong. She says sex, gender, and sexuality must be differentiated. With Grenz, we must affirm that all human relations take place between persons with embodied sex and culturally influenced gendered identities. Nevertheless, not all these relations are sexual. That is, they do not arise from sexual need, desire, or action. A mother's relationship with her child is influenced by her biological sex, as well as her culturally influenced and experientially formed gender identity. Very careful with her language there. But it is not, nor should it be sexual, that is, based on erotic desire, need, or activity. It's only when we separate these categories that we're able to name some sexual relations as sin. Her concern is, in a world that's already saturated with sex, talking about all our relationships as sexual is just more confusing. And I think, obviously, okay? In fact, she pushes it further, and she says that also has a tendency to sexualize the Trinity itself in a way that is unhelpful, again, because we live in a world where the god of sex is very prevalent, okay? So DeFranza seeks to fix this by starting with the reality of God as loving community, social, and finding room for the sexual relationship within that concept. But even though our concern is clearly right, we have seen tonight that there's still a strong connection between the broader need for community and our sexuality. Okay? In other words, they both miss the real thing by not seeing how we get from a sexual relationship to community and how naturally that works. Okay? Even DeFrenza's illustration of a mother and her child. That's not a sexual relationship, but it is the product of another sexual relationship, isn't it? It would not exist without a sexual relationship. The relationship that that woman has with a child is the direct product of another sexual relationship. In other words, children have parents because their parents have a sexual relationship. Children have siblings, and they share those siblings because they share the same parents who have a sexual relationship. Okay? In other words, what I'm suggesting to you tonight is that sex is the cement of society. It's not that we should have sexual relationships with all people, but without sexual relationships, there'd be no other people. Okay? Jumping forward here. The fundamental question is whether sex is inherently communal and relational and not necessarily in oppressive or gender-biased ways. Sex or sexuality is not only a matter of individual sex drive or sex desire, indeed desire itself is a drive towards another. Sex as a bodily reality grounds biological connections to other human beings, minimally for every human being to one's intergenerational family of origin. It's always socialized in institutions which channel its expressions, recognize the alliances it creates, and protects the children it engenders. As such, it yields social forms of family, clan, tribe, ethnicity, and even nationhood. What makes you a part of your family? The reality of sex. What makes you a part of your tribe or your clan? The reality of sex. What makes you a part of your race? The reality of sex. And in many cases, what makes you a part of your nation? The reality of sex, right? That your birth relationship was either from people of that nation or happened in, like in America, happened in the location of that nation. Okay, so again, society is cultivated and reached through this process of man and woman joined together towards the end of procreation. Obviously, that makes the sexual relationship not merely about two people. Listen to this. I think this is so smart. Janelle William Paris. In this light, sex, like marriage in general, is only partly about the individual and his or her desires. It's always about others. Certainly, the other partner in marriage is important, but here is a host of absent others. It's an act of love towards all others in the world to refrain from sex with them. And there's potential others, children not yet conceived, adopted, or even wanted. In this sexual dimension, then, marriage is not primarily a dispenser of pleasure for individuals. Rather, it connects the self with one another and expresses love for all others, even those who exist as possibilities. Now, here's the kicker. We saw a few weeks ago that marriage itself, the relationship between a man and a woman, will pass away. Right? There's something about this sexual relationship that is by design temporary, but the product of that sexual relationship is eternal. It is not the marriages that will continue into heaven, but the sons and daughters, the brothers and sisters will. Okay? Like Wendy Alsop says, although human marriage between men and women doesn't persevere into eternity, relationship does. Relationships in community, brotherhood and sisterhood, not marriage, are the good of the two genders from Genesis 2:18 that endures into eternity future. So when God says it's not good that man should be alone, there are three goods that God gives in Eve. He gives female to male, and that exists into eternity. He gives wife to husband, and that is temporary. And then he gives procreation, the possibility of mother and father, and the byproduct of that relationship populates heaven. Okay? All right. Again, just to nail it down, Claire Smith, the main problem for Adam was not singleness, it was solitude. He was alone, not unmarried. Okay? The need was community, and Eve was both a participant in that and a means to a greater end of that. One last time, and then we'll take a break. Man's aloneness was not good, but Genesis does not see the solution in one intimate partner for personal sharing. Again, unlike most romantic comedies, the story of the Bible doesn't end with the presentation of Eve. It's not roll credits then, right? Rather, man needs a human society to live in, a household, and a people. To use the description in Genesis 1, the man needed more people to fill the earth and rule over it, and he needed to be able to increase and multiply, which he could not do in and of himself. Okay. What we've seen so far is that the marriage relationship and our sexuality itself is oriented towards community. And so now we need to talk about the biblical shape of that community. And this is pretty obvious stuff at first. So I'm really just getting you comfortable, and then I'm going to pull the rug out from under us tonight. But notice here that the biblical shape of that community starts with marriage, but ultimately it begins with family. Okay, so with Adam and Eve, we begin just with Adam and then with Eve. And then Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain. And just after this, she bears Abel, so we have the family. But usually we stop there and we forget the fact that what happens in the rest of this chapter is we watch as that family grows into a community. Now, this is a little bit muddled, right? Because Cain is sent away from his family. He starts his own civilization. But notice how it works out here. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he called the name of that city after the name of his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Arad fathered Mehujael, Mehujael fathered Methuselah, and Methuselah fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives, and the name of one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. Okay, now generally when we read this, we rightly recognize how off-kilter everything is. Right? By the time we get to Lamech, 7 generations in, he's like, you know what, polygamy sounds fine to me. And then he goes on and he murders someone and uses the mark of Cain as a justification of his murder, okay? But what we don't always notice is coexisting with that is the fulfillment of God-designed realities. The world is fallen, but the image of God is not lost, even if it's tarnished. And so notice, here we get to the 8th generation, and Ada bores Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. That is the beginning of agriculture. Okay. His brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. That's the beginning of culture. That's the arts. Okay. And then Zillah also bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. That's technology. In other words, there's a direct line from Adam and Eve who had Cain to society. Okay. And a part of what happens when God calls us to rule over the world involves what we call the cultural mandate, which is not just a position we have over the world as it is, but a cultivation of that world, a cultivation of the gifts that God has given us, the gifts of language, the gifts of creativity, the gifts of society interacting, the gifts of science, all of these things. And we see that on play here, but it moves from the family to society. We see the same thing with Adam Mark II, also known as Noah, right? Noah begins with a family. Here in the book of Genesis, God spares Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But Shem, Ham, and Japheth each go on to have children. And notice at the end of chapter 10 here, these are the clans of the son of Noah, according to their genealogy, in the nations. And from these, the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. And so here it goes from one family to the 70 nations that make up the ancient world. And notice here, this is where they begin to spread abroad and fill out the world. Be fruitful and multiply, spread over the earth. That's happening here. Okay. We see the same thing with God's special family, Israel, which begins with a family, but a different one, right? An old man and his barren wife. Okay. So it's a miraculous family, but a family nonetheless. And that family starts with Abraham, and then suddenly we have Isaac, and Isaac moves to Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons, which become the 12 tribes. Okay. In fact, notice here how big this trajectory in God's plan really is. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. But Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you've given me no offspring. and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said, this man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. Okay, so first, procreation, having of a child. But it doesn't stop there. He brought him outside and said, look towards the heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Not just one son, but an innumerable multitude of descendants. Okay. In fact, it is his faith in this promise of God that defines Abraham as the father of faith, because Abraham believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Okay. Because of the centrality of this, promise to Abraham, procreation is primary in the Old Testament. It's bound up in the promises of Abraham. Descendants like the stars is where Israel is headed. Not only that, but it's evidence of the covenant. Okay? In other words, in Deuteronomy, Moses lays out a way of life and a way of death. Keep the covenant, and it will lead to these blessings. Disobey the covenant, and you'll experience these curses. And notice how the blessings are suggested here. If you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above the nations of the earth. And then a little bit further, specifically, the Lord will make you abound in prosperity in the fruit of your womb. Okay. And so how was Israel to know if they were on the track? The procreation numbers were up. Okay. And remember here, these blessings and curses are not for individual Israelites. Although barrenness was seen as a curse in the Old Testament, it wasn't evidence that they were a covenant breaker. We'll come back to that in just a second. But nationally, God put in a warning system for Israel going astray, and that included if procreation was happening. And so when we get to the corresponding curses, if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, we see the opposite here. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb. Okay. It's also bound up in the future hope of Israel. All the way back at Eve, in the midst of the judgment of Adam and Eve and their sin, God gives a promise. He says, I'm going to put enmity between the seed of the woman, procreation, and the seed of the serpent. And the serpent's head is going to be crushed by the seed of the woman. Right? It's this thinly veiled messianic promise where God basically says, I'm going to send a redeemer. In fact, do you remember what we read about Eve's proclamation when Cain was born? I've received a man with the help of the Lord. Literally in the Hebrew there, it's I've received a man, the Lord. She goes, Cain, boom, that's the redeemer that God has promised. And she was wrong. Cain's a murderer. Okay. In fact, Noah, what does his name mean? It means rest. And why does his dad call him rest? Because this is the one who will give us rest from the curse. And he's wrong. Noah's the only survivor of a worldwide flood. But the anticipation, the looking for the Messiah exists all the way in Genesis, and all the more so as God continues to clearly lay out those promises. And the picture of the coming Messiah becomes more defined. And this is why barrenness was seen as a curse in Israel. Because any pregnant woman could be the mother of the promised one. And so not having child was a cutting off from the great privilege, the blessed among women, that the angel announces to Mary. Okay. Hence, barrenness is seen as a curse, and that was true for men as well. Not having children cut you off from the fulfillment of God's promises. Because how was Abraham going to enjoy God's promises? Through his descendants. But if you didn't have any children there to see it, you, in a sense, missed out on God's promises. So procreation was primary. But here's the weird thing. When we get to the New Testament, it's very different. When we get to the New Testament, the family is not the emphasized community. This begins with Jesus. Okay. One organization that I'm sure has been beneficial to you as it was to me, I still remember listening to James Dobson talk about puberty when I was a teenager. Was Focus on the Family, but I've always thought they were unfortunately named because they can never take Jesus as their poster child. If we ask the question, was Jesus into family values, then we have to go, okay, what did Jesus say about families? And it's hard to find positive statements. Yes, he maintains the importance of caring for your parents in their old age and not saying Corbin and giving a gift to God. He believes in honor your father and mother. But listen to the other things he says. First, Jesus himself had no wife or children, despite the fact he was of the age when good Jewish boys would settle down and get married, get on with their life. Okay, so when we get to Jesus on the family, consider this. Don't think that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword, for I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household. And he says, that's why I've come, to break up families. Okay. Consider this one. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Again, reiterated here. So there, it's, you got to love me more, but listen to the words in Luke. If anyone comes after me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Now, there is some Semitic idioms going on there. When Jesus talks here about love and hate, he's not talking about a passionate displeasure in another person. He's talking about a prioritized choice. That if you have to choose between Father and Jesus, there's only one option. Okay? If Jesus is not Lord of all, Martin Lloyd-Jones used to say, he's not Lord at all. And that is the point that's being made here. But he pits himself against the familial relationships. Okay? Here, what about Jesus with his own family? While he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside asking to speak to him, but he replied to the man who told him, "Who is my mother, and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, "Here are my mothers and brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Here's the one we started our class with in Matthew 19. The disciples said, remember, Jesus is so hard on divorce. What God has joined together, let no man tear asunder. The disciples say to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. And remember, the concern here is not about marriage. It's about family. Okay. In fact, listen to the words here of Barry Danilik. It's important to understand the Jewish context. Rabbi Eleazar, a few generations before Jesus, is quoted as saying, any man who has no wife is no proper man, for it said, male and female, he created them. Rabbi Joshua confirms, do not say, I shall not get married, but get married and produce sons and daughters, and so increase procreation in the world. Marriage was necessary in order to fulfill the command of the law to be fruitful and multiply, one of the 613 recognized commandments of the Torah, and one required of every Jewish male. Not only is it one of the 613, it's the first one. Okay. Moreover, as we've seen, marriage and procreation were necessary for the reception of God's covenantal blessings. Okay. And so when the disciples say it's better not to be married, they're going against the grain of everything they understand and everything they're taught. And remember, Jesus doesn't clarify, he doubles down. And he says, what you're right is true. What you say is true. And then he upholds the eunuch, again, not merely someone who won't have a sexual relationship, but one who won't have children, as being a model of following Jesus. Okay. And it's not just Jesus. The New Testament as a whole follows suit. Paul, here in 1 Corinthians, explains that he himself was single and celibate, but he not only chooses not to marry himself, but encourages others to do the same. And remember, Paul is trained at the feet of Gamaliel, one of these rabbis who were maintaining the tradition and upholding the Torah. He tells us he was devoted to keeping the law. And so listen to these words out of that man's mouth. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind or one as another. To the unmarried and widows, I say that it's good for them to remain single as I am. He says you should think about being single. It's a good and viable option. In fact, notice he says later, so then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she's happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. What does he say here? He says that singleness is not just a viable option. In Paul's opinion, it's a better and even a happier option. Okay. Not only that, but the New Testament never repeats the command to procreate. It talks about the relationships between parents and children, but it doesn't say, go have kids, even though that's reiterated continuously in the Old Testament. Nor does it tie the blessings that we enjoy as Christians to the having of children. Okay. This is because the seed of expectation in the Old Testament has come in Jesus. Listen to the words of the book of Galatians, and as we do this, we followed Adam and his family. We followed Noah and his family. We followed Abraham and his family, but now let's look at the seed, the promised one, and his family, and it's a little bit different. So notice this here in Galatians 3:16. Now the promises that were made to Abraham, the ones we read about in Genesis 15, and to his offspring, it does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, singular, which is Christ. Now, to be clear here, in Hebrew, as well as in the Greek, the plural of offspring is offspring. The plural of seed is seed. Okay? He's not making a point on the grammar of the Old Testament, but on the meaning of it. And the meaning is the full promises that were promised to Abraham are bound up in one descendant, Christ. Not only that, but through our relationship with Jesus, we've become part of Abraham's family. If you're Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So he is the one promised offspring, but in being joined to him, we are also now Abraham's offspring, plural. We are part of that multitude that numbers like the stars. So here he says we've been adopted into the family of Abraham. Do you see that? But that's not where Paul stops in Galatians, because it's greater than that. Look at what he says in chapter 4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those that were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent his Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. What family have we been adopted to here? Not Abraham's, but God himself. And not only that, but he says here that we are co-heirs with Christ. We are fully participating equals in what we receive in Christ. His destiny is our destiny. The blessings available in Christ are fully available to us, single or married, parent or no. Okay. Danilic really doubles down on this. In the Sinai covenant, being married and having offspring played a fundamental role in fulfilling the blessings of the covenant. Moreover, as the narrative of Ruth aptly illustrates, the Messianic seed itself was to come through the physical procreation of individual Israelites. Pause. Let me explain. The book of Ruth is not just a story about a bachelor finding a wife. It's a story about the Messianic line cul-de-sacking in a bachelor. How does the book of Ruth begin? In the days of the judges. And what is the big refrain at the end of the book of Judges? In those days, there was no king in Israel. What do the people need? They need a king. And Boaz, who's in the kingly line, the messianic line, the red line that traces all the way from Genesis chapter 1, the seed of the woman, all the way through, it dead ends in Boaz, and God brings him miraculously a wife named Ruth, and she fathers Obed. And Obed fathers another who fathers Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. And that's how the book of Ruth ends, with the provision of a king and with the continuation of that messianic line. Okay? So he says here, the way God is moving this forward requires procreation. We can't get to Jesus without Ruth meeting Boaz, without them consummating the marriage and having a birth that leads to Obed, and so down the line. But notice as he continues, physical procreation was the divinely ordained means by which God in his appointed time was going to ultimately bless the world through the provision of his Son. In the new covenant, the picture is different. All the blessings of the new covenant come to us through Christ. He is the sufficient source. All other material blessings of creation, whether blessings of food, clothing, shelter, monetary provision, healthy bodies, marriage, family, and even life itself, all these utterly pale in comparison to the blessing that God has given us in Christ. The blessings include our full and complete reconciliation to God himself, and our glorious inheritance as members, of his eternal kingdom. Nothing, and I mean nothing, can remotely compare with the glory and weight of these new covenantal blessings. Okay. In other words, family becomes optional in the new covenant because the purpose of family has come and is now fully available to us in Jesus Christ. The blessings that God was going to bring about through mankind have been brought in Jesus, and we enjoy them fully in our joining to Christ, not our joining to anyone else. Okay. Now, really important, this doesn't replace the family in the old covenant with individuality in the new, which is how we tend to think of it, right? Just me and Jesus. Salvation is personal. Jesus came to save me. I have a personal relationship with him. All of that's true, but it's not the whole truth. Okay, I want to skip that quote for time. But notice this. What we have in Jesus is not individuality, not isolation or aloneness, just me and Jesus, but we have a new community. And so Paul encourages a young pastor by the name of Timothy here. He says, don't rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men treat as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity. So Paul gives one idea, one concept of how to relate to people into the church, and it's very simply treat them like family. Right? In fact, in the New Testament, although the family metaphor is emphasized all the time, what is Paul's favorite address when he wants to speak to other Christians? Brothers and sisters. A closer relationship is suggested. And we're told that the New Testament church is not merely a family, but a body, and each of us are members. Right? We talked earlier about it's that shared purpose of unity that makes your body your body. Our shared connection with Jesus makes us one. Okay. The relationships here in the church are primary in the new covenant. Greater than blood because of the blood of Christ. And they are also permanent, eternal. That's why the hippies like to call themselves God's forever family. It's to be a community of full and deep love. It's to be a community of care and support. Just trace the one another's through the New Testament. Just consider John, who in John 3:16 we all know, but 1 John 3:16 he says, "By this we know love, that Christ laid down his life for us, so also we ought to love the brothers and sisters." Okay? It's to be this relationship of deep love, of care and support. He goes on to say that because that's the case, if you have the world's goods and see your brother or sister in need and do not help them, how does the love of God abide in you? Okay. Also, it's a community like marriage of commitment and covenant. Okay. Marriage is a relationship that has commitment, that has connection, has a permanency to it, is based on a covenant, and so is the church. According to its original intent, the church does indeed constitute a bonded fellowship, a community of persons. Like marriage, the church community is ultimately based on a covenant, specifically the covenant of believers to their common Lord, and by extension, of believers to each other. That's why the church has always seen the entrance into the church as the act of baptism. It's not just a public profession to the world out there, it's the joining of the baptized, a community. And also we see this in communion, which is why it has the word union in it, where we don't just join with Christ, but with one another. In fact, and he's about to talk about this, but I can't resist myself, when Paul warns us about taking communion in an unworthy manner in 1 Corinthians, he says it's because we aren't rightly discerning the body. The danger there is not that we don't understand the substance of the bread and the cup. It's that we don't understand the unity of the body. Go look at it. His concern is that the rich people in the church are treating the poor people in the church wrongly. And that's what he means when he says they're not discerning the body. We all partake of the same bread. We all have one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one Spirit, right? But communion points to this. In fact, it's an expression of the church is entered by this public declaration of covenant, or covenantal act, baptism. For the early church, the act of covenanting was that of water baptism, which entailed not only an outward confession of faith, but membership in the covenanting community as well. Not only is this community entered by a public act of covenanting, it's nurtured by public acts of covenant renewal. It's in this context that the Lord's Supper derives its important meaning. The continual observance of this memorial meal is to be understood as the occasion of renewal of the covenant by the participants. Paul alluded to this idea in his warning to the Corinthian believers that a believer cannot drink both at the table of demons and at the Lord's table. What does he say? He says you cannot have fellowship with demons. Again, the idea is one of communion. Participation in this rite is a declaration of loyalty to the Lord Jesus and thereby an act of solidarity with the community of his loyal followers. Modern Western society, with its individualistic emphasis, has contributed to the loss of this understanding of the church. There's a pastor who I know and love and respect, and when I use the word pastor for him, he is a model pastor. But one of the things he's done as long as he's had a ministry is he's made communion just available every day, open in his church, so that people on their own time can come in and partake. It just does not line up with the New Testament model. Communion is not a private and individual act. It is a community act of the body of the local church. That's why maybe in your church, the one I grew up in was this way, and I still value this. We pass the elements first and then we partake together. Okay. I have nothing against coming forward and doing other things, but that one rightly gets the broad community aspect of this. Now, here's what we have learned tonight. For Christians, because of Jesus, marriage and starting a family is optional. Participating in the church family is not. This is true for all people, but it's especially important for singles, for celibates, and for those who Jesus spoke of whose conversion would cost them their physical families. Listen to this here. Jesus says, "And everyone who's left houses, or brothers, or sisters, or father or mother, or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life." He doesn't just say, if you leave these things, don't worry, there's still heaven. He says, if you leave these things in this life, you'll get 100-fold more. Jesus promises a blessing to those who follow Jesus at the cost of their family, and that blessing is to be us. My dream is that the church would in practice be such a great family that it would make marriage and family practically optional. Where the young people in our church would grow up and go, I'm not sure I need to get married. Because that's a significant part of how Paul draws his conclusions. Because he does have a family. He has his son in the Lord, Timothy, right? He has his brothers and sisters, co-laborers in the field. Listen, Yarhouse points out, when Christians discuss love and intimacy with one another, there's a sense in which we say that genital sexual acts are not the most important expression of love, which has implication for singles, whether they experience same-sex attraction or not. Even when genital acts are experienced in the context of heterosexual marriage, they're still not the most important expression of love. Rather, the most important expression of love and intimacy in the life of the Christian is meant to be experienced in Christian community, in the church. In this way, again, our sexuality points to God. And specifically, it points to God as triune. God is community, Father, Son, and Spirit. We've already seen that our personhood as individuals in our embodied sexuality points to God's personhood. We are full persons because God is personal. We've already seen that the intimacy of the one flesh union points to the intimacy between any two members of the Trinity. The Father is in me, Jesus says, and I am in the Father. However, God is not duality, but triune. He is three persons, a true community. You know the saying, 3 is a crowd, right? We cross a significant threshold. And what you have then is not 3 people in relationship. You have, I hate doing the math on this. You have a significant multiplication of relationships, right? In this way, our sexuality not only points to God and who he is in his being, but again to our relationship with God and one another as his family. The New Testament declares that all of us, male or female, this follows directly what we read in Galatians earlier, are sons. And the reason why that's significant, just like it told us a few weeks ago that all of us who are men are the bride of Christ, the reason why it's significant that all of you women are the sons of Christ is because sons are the inheritors. And you have the full inheritance in Jesus Christ. And not just the full inheritance of the men in the church, the full inheritance of Jesus himself. That's how much we become participants in the family. We're not just the awkward and adopted almost family. We are the fully incorporated children of God. And that also makes us brothers and sisters in the Lord. And again, not just brothers and sisters. What did Paul tell Timothy? The older women as mothers, the younger ones as sisters. Okay? In other words, there should be an emphasis on the generational distinctions and our need not just for peers of the opposite gender within the church, but of mother figures and father figures, of people who are like a child to us in the Lord, or even of godly grandchildren. We are to be this family and to do life together in such a way that we make God's love visible. Isn't that what Jesus said? By this they will know that you're my disciples. By your love. And not just your love for what? Your love for one another. The church is to be the hermeneutic of the gospel, by which I mean it is the lens that both makes the gospel visible and it is the lens that validates that the gospel is real. Okay. So, again, even though in a different way our sexuality in the New Testament is oriented towards community, but here that's expressed through the fact that the offspring, the seed, the expected one, the promised one has come, and by being grafted into him, we're not just grafted into the line of Abraham, not just cultivated into the olive tree of Israel, but brought into the very family of God and God's forever family. Let's pray, and then we'll take some questions. Father, this is such good news because we don't have to trace our own families very long to recognize that they're broken, that they're distant. We don't have to trace this to recognize the lack in infertile bodies, in unchosen singleness, even in divorce and in widowhood and these things, and yet you have given us a family that persists and consists of something broader and more permanent than that, that goes deeper than the blood of our biology into the very blood of sacrifice, the blood of God himself poured out for us, tying us together, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and making us the new community, family as it was intended. And we just pray, Lord, let it be as it is supposed to be. We know, Lord, that because of the way sin works in our lives, we are the greatest threat to our families, to this community called the church, and we need you to continue this promised path of sanctification, making us more like you so that we can be what you have for us, so that we can be the family of God. But we also know, Lord, that you've only given us one and only one way to do that, which is not just a Bible in isolation, Lord, but it is participation in this community called the church. Sanctification is a community project. I pray, Lord, that we would be full participants in that we would both give and receive, that we would both find belonging and purpose, and we would also be fully present, fully vulnerable, fully available in the church as we are, knowing that none of us stands here based on our talent or our righteousness, but by the free gift of salvation in Jesus Christ. And so we don't have to earn our place in the church, Lord. Just like we don't have to earn our place in our physical families. We were born into it. We praise you for that truth. We ask that we would act like it is true. In Jesus' name.